Chapter 23. Thieves and Murderers. The woman was touching herself, caressing her neck and chest, absent-mindedly rubbing the tops of her thighs, then falling forward, her eyes closed in ecstasy, her hands clasped together as she responded to Theopin's words, spoken from the stage over the heads of an enraptured audience, crowded into the main hall. Between Theopin and the woman, in a small room that opened into the hall, stood a few hundred people, nearly all the believers who lived in the caves, packed closely together in the stifling air, silent as they listened to hear the words of their leader, words that mesmerized them like a spell, that caused them to forget the fetid air, their aching feet, and, in the case of the woman sitting across the corridor from Sabrina, any sense of self-consciousness and any burden of obligation to the children seated next to her. Sabrina snagged the hand of the woman's son, keeping him from sticking a clod of dirt into his mouth. His skeletal older sister stared at Sabrina with an expression devoid of emotion or connection. She looked to be 7 or 8 years old, but over the 3 weeks since coming to the rebel camp, Sabrina had learned that, like most of the children who were forced to live in the caves, she was likely older and stunted from the limited rations. The sound of Theopin's voice broke her reverie. "We all remember what we learned in school," he said with a sarcastic emphasis. "Well, perhaps with the exception of Rickard here." He gestured to a figure in the front row. The crowd laughed. Sabrina had learned that Rickard was the name of Tree Trunk, the man whose shoulder she had dislocated. He and the other soldiers often took up the front rows of the prayer assemblies, but the sense of order and hierarchy that the word soldier implied was absent among them. They answered only to Dr. Rindle or Theopin. Some preferred to report to Grange, but this was completely voluntary. And although Grange himself took pains to be obedient to Theopin, it was out of Grange's own sense of obligation. With the exception of those who reported to Grange, most soldiers never seemed to go out on patrol. They spent most of their time sleeping, eating, and laughing among themselves in the main hall. Theopin occasionally took them on trips away from the caves for reflection. Sabrina suspected that these trips were actually for more martial training, but she had no more proof than a hunch. Although she learned that most of the residents were grateful for those times when the soldiers were gone and the halls were quieter, they also seemed more on edge, their sense of vulnerability to attack from the ministry heightened. So they tolerated the soldiers and their boorishness out of some need for protection. Soldier or not, twice a week, all the rebels gathered for assembly, when Grange, Dr. Rindle, or another of Theopin's close advisors would share reflections, or read from forbidden texts that they had translated. Latecomers gathered in the shadows of the hallways where Sabrina now sat with the enraptured woman. By a trick of the caves, the sound was actually better in these corridors, and Sabrina could sit unseen and listen. She preferred it this way. She did not wish to give Theopin the pleasure of knowing that she attended. At about every other assembly Theopin spoke, and these were the days Sabrina made sure she did not miss. Not because she was beginning to believe. Rather, she was trying to understand the pull the man had on the soldiers and the rebels, on Grange, on the woman before her, and on Lindsey. Half the time Sabrina and Lindsey were together, her friend was in thrall of Theopin. His insight was so powerful, his words so moving, life-changing even. But other times, Lindsey would be somber and quiet, voicing her doubts and disagreements with some of Theopin's more martial proclamations. Lindsey made these admissions with embarrassment that bordered on shame. When Sabrina suggested that he was a charlatan, Lindsey had lashed out at her. "What do you know? You're not even a believer!" Only to immediately apologize. Sabrina had said little on the topic since. Now, when Lindsey was in her somber moods, she sought out Grange instead of Sabrina. So Sabrina listened, rolling and twisting the cords on the sleeves of her pullover until they were frayed and wet with sweat. She missed her patrol suit, but it had not been returned to her since her induction. Theopin moved across the stage, taking long steps towards the edge, as if he were about to walk into space, stopping short and wiping his brow. The air was soupy with dust, like a cloud that formed above a herd of animals. The odor of bodies and damp cotton clothes was overwhelming, but Theopin and his followers did not notice. "Science has answers, or so we were taught in the ministry schools," he said. "I will not take issue with that. The miracle of life in all its complexity, all its variety and beauty, is explained. What to us seems a miraculous design, the wing of a dragonfly, the tail of a scorpion, a newborn's eyes, can be understood. Each structure, each being arising over the millennium, a blink of an eye in a long geological age of our world. "I'm sorry," he said in another aside. "Rickard, that was a big word, wasn't it? Don't worry, I can explain it later." More laughter, especially from Rickard himself, his arm in a sling, flattered at being singled out twice. Each structure is an accumulation of small, slow, but brutal choices by nature, where those who possessed what was required thrived, and those who did not died. This is what science has taught us. Let us not forget its lessons, for science has brought light to our darkness, movements when we were sedentary, healing when we were wounded, truth where there was ignorance, even life where there was death. But that is not all science has brought. Behold the cruelty of the Elveds, the death, destruction, and ruin as witnessed by previous generations. He shook his head with sorrow. Sabrina was unsure if it was genuine or for effect. Theopin continued in a soft voice as if choked with emotion. Science unlocked. Also brought death where there was life. Pain where there was previously happiness. Lies when we needed truth. Science has answers. But science does not have all the answers. Science unguided can be used for evil ends. He let his words settle on the crowd. The believers were silent. Science is not enough for our biggest questions, Theopin continued. Our dear leader Dagosta would say science is our answer. He would say that there is no master. But none of you are here today because you believe our dear leader, are you? And I ask you this, why don't you believe Dagosta? He has science on his side. He has proof. But what proof do you have of our master's existence? Are you all fools? Are you all mad? Sabrina saw her uncle kneeling, a broken look in his eyes, as she and Lindsey teetered on the edge of the waterworks. Don't try to follow us. She pinched the bridge of her nose in vain effort to ward away a headache. Theopin had moved again, and she leaned around the rock wall to watch. A cadre of seated men and women in robes sweated behind him, their faces rapt, hands clasped. They often referred to her uncle. He was the antagonist in many of Theopin's speeches, and despite all that she now knew, Sabrina still felt defensive whenever his name was invoked, a protectiveness towards her uncle that she wished she could will away. Theopin repeated his last question, prompting the woman beside Sabrina to mutter a nonsensical, "Yes, yes." Sabrina lost the battle to keep the boy from ingesting filth as he clacked his teeth on a stone he had picked up. His sister had wandered farther down the hall, where she had curled up in a corner, her arms over her head, and closed her eyes in listless sleep. Dagosta is not all wrong. Not all right, either. More laughter. Sabrina felt the heat rise on her skin each time. He is right because science starts with a question. Why? It is in our nature to question why. Why does the bird fly? Why does the scorpion sting? Why do we see with our eyes, not, say, our bellies? Why is a question we ask from childhood. Why does the sun set? Why do the stars shine? Why does the stone fall when I drop it? Why is water wet? Mothers, you can testify to your children's inquisitiveness. Why, they ask. More laughter and clapping. But the whys do not end in childhood, do they? Theopin asked, his voice low now, his tone serious. Why can't I find friends? Why can't I find love? What will I do with my life? What profession should I seek? Why do you love me? Why don't you love me? Why do we die? What is next? The room was silent now. You are all here because of the whys. The logical, reasonable, and even accurate answers of science were not enough. Those answers spoke to a piece of you, but not all of you. And they shouldn't. Our Creator doesn't want that. No, if you are looking for proof of His existence, look in front of you. Look at all who have come asking, why? Look inward, into yourself. At that same unending circle of questions that began in childhood and continues to this day. That flow of why has brought you here. Past dangers, over deserts, through pain, hardship, loss. These questions that science does not, could not answer. We are constantly driven to know more, to seek more. Science is one branch of this stream, but science is but a branch, a stream of a wide river. For even in science, as in life, once we have one answer, we are not satisfied. It is not long before we ask again, why? We always desire to have more. We all know there is no limit to the question, why? It does not stop with the sky or the stars. Otherwise, why would we be here? Does the bird question? The scorpion? The fish in the sea? No. But we do. We are driven from within, driven to seek despite the threat of death. And I will tell you now, there is no end. We will never stop asking why. Our spirits have an unending drive to seek truth. We are oriented to the horizon. But can we reach it? Not in this life. He stopped and raised a single finger into the air. Sweat glistened on his skin, and his robes rustled as he took deep breaths before plunging onward. But I say this. Only a divine hand would craft us in such a way that we would seek Him. Only a divine hand would give to our hearts a compass needle that is not oriented north, south, east, or west, but to Him. To Him. Causing us to ask, why? In a way that no other creatures do. Our yearning causing us to seek. Our yearning, unlike the yearning of any other creatures, is proof enough of His existence. That He is there, waiting for us. That He loves us more than any other creatures. Theopin's voice crescendoed, and the hall erupted in cheers, cries, and shouts. The woman beside Sabrina fell to her knees, weeping, causing her son to stop chewing on his rock, and her daughter to open her eyelids momentarily. Theopin rode the wave of enthusiasm. And if science finds a way to explain this longing on our part, a question of the brain, a reaction among chemicals, and a ganglion of nerves, if science can explain it, will it explain away our master? No more so than if we find a scientific reason for why a mother loves a child. If science can explain it, does it make her love less real? No! I say, no! The cheering, the singing, the spontaneous eruptions continued for a few minutes before the noise died down. Theopin called for calm, his smile flashing across his face as he continued in softer tones. The road may not be a straight one for us. We may be traveling too far left, too far right in our journey towards Him, but our Master can draw straight, even with crooked lines. More cheers. He chose to shout over them now. We have seen that even an unbeliever can be used as an instrument by the Master to teach us, and in the process be converted. He is using me. Now the woman turned to her, placing her hand on Sabrina's arm so that she could feel the heat of her body through her clothes. He is speaking to you, she said, leaning so close that Sabrina could smell her breath, which stank of rotting teeth. She pulled herself away gently, her ears ringing, her molars grinding against one another. "And there will come a time when we'll all be tested!" Theopin's voice was booming now, echoing off the ceiling and down the passageways. "But remember that you have proof already. You have seen the proof. It is only for you to believe. Armed with that, nothing can stop you." Another wave of cheers and chants followed. Then the noise settled down into a general din as the elders behind Theopin stood up, left the stage, and returned, escorting 3 teenage children, 2 boys and a girl. Each was dressed for travel, with long robes protecting his or her body from the sun, head wraps, and belts of provisions around their waists and chests. The long knives on their hips did not escape Sabrina's notice, nor the fresh ink that had been tattooed on their hands and forearms. The crowd grew quiet again as Theopin introduced the newest pilgrims, as he called the Skrits. While they initially appeared nervous and unsure, looking to the elders and one another for cues where to stand and whom to face, as Theopin goaded them to pray and testify, they grew in their determination, their eyes fierce, their hands still bloody from the painful inking process rounded into fists. The girl's voice rang out especially loud, like a clarion. "Are you ready to go?" A voice next to Sabrina startled her. In her anger, Sabrina had not noticed Sprocket come up behind her. "Yes," she said. "I've heard enough." Yellow hollyhock and lavender hyacinth stirred in the breeze that gently eased up the hillside. The heart-shaped leaves of a redbud tree twisted overhead. A buzzard alighted on a rock outcropping farther down the ridge, and a honeybee buzzed beside Sabrina's ear. She breathed deeply, closing off her awareness of everything but her target. She narrowed her eyes across the length of the blaster to the standing stone. It was scorched and cracked from previous blasts. The air between the muzzle of the weapon and the target shimmered with heat haze. Sabrina breathed out and pulled the trigger. A yellow ball of plasma exploded against the stone, setting it teetering. Sprocket's face was flushed from the heat. "Nicely done. That one's finished." Sabrina lowered the weapon, jerked the handle with her thumb, and sent the gun into a spin around her finger. Well balanced, it twirled better than some of the others she had adjusted for him that morning. Out of impulse, she flung it over her shoulder, caught it with the opposite hand, and switched hands again before dropping it into an imaginary holster. She did this without looking, and instead watched Sprocket's expression as he inched away, moving back again only when she handed the gun to him. "Why do you do that?" he asked. "Flair. I did it on patrol, at the shooting range, in the station garage, whenever there were others watching me. Good is not good enough when you're a female cadet. You have to prove yourself, prove that you are better, because in their eyes, you're always worse." Not so different from being an undersized man among soldiers," Sprocket said. It gave Sabrina pause. To her, men were men, but Sprocket, lean, shorter than average, would fall to the bottom of any hierarchy built on strength and speed. She felt an unexpected affection for him. "So you turned to machines?" "I was already good at them, but it gave me reason to excel." He set down the blaster along the row of weapons they had brought to calibrate. "Gave me something to feel proud about when I knew I was never going to be able to be captain of the pitchball squad." "But how did you ever teach yourself how to spin a gun like that without hurting yourself?" Sabrina chuckled. "With a lot of error. Once I was issued a blaster, I would practice in my apartment. I hit myself a couple times with a few stray stuns. Lindsey found me one day passed out in a pool of my own urine." "Did she tell you to stop?" "No," Sabrina said. She turned her face to the valley below, where children from the camp were picking fruits and nuts, and she tried to parse out the pang of sadness she suddenly felt in her gut. "No, Lindsey understood. She sculpted me a replica that afternoon, balanced perfectly. I practiced with it until I was flawless." She sat down with her chin in her hand. Sprocket came beside her and handed her the next gun. It was a projectile rifle. Sabrina snapped out of the thoughts that were weighing down upon her. No, not those. Why not? He asked, the grass blade he had been chewing bouncing on his lips. Those are only for killing. All the other weapons can be set on stun. Sprocket put the rifle down. You really think they're going to keep these guns on stun? They could. Maybe they will. Maybe there is time to convince them to. Sprocket shook his head and sat down on a rock next to her. They both watched as the children gathered pistachios, adding them to the other fruits, oranges, lickeys, and olives, in their baskets. She noticed that he checked the sky reflexively. Maybe, he said after a long while. He plucked a nearby piece of grass from the ground and replaced the frayed stem in his mouth. About time we should be going. He stood and stretched. They collected the children from their gathering group. The rebels sent out a few such groups each day to forage for food. Children were often picked for these outings. They were eager for an excuse to leave the caves, but Sabrina silently objected, believing they should be in a school of some kind. Even an occultist teacher was better than nothing. Although Sabrina struggled with the discomfort of helping Sprocket repair weapons that would likely be used against officers, she was also grateful to leave the caves. It was an opportunity to be outside, to feel the sun on her skin and breathe fresh air. And as much as she loved Lindsey, it felt like a reprieve from a ward for the mentally ill. Lindsey was happy, happier than Sabrina had ever seen her, and that mattered. But she knew her own presence was not permanent. It could not be. But where she could go next was unresolved. As she and Sprocket made their way over the last ridge to look down on the overhang that concealed the yawning opening to their subterranean world, she felt her heart sink. No matter how much time she spent there among the rebels, the place felt more like a tomb than home. Despite all the people, and even Lindsey, Sabrina was lonely in a way her friend could not understand. She was respected, feared, even revered after the fight that had sanctified her. But in the end, she was in the same place she began. Alone. She preferred the company of children, who were too young to form their own opinions or to understand what terms like sanctified or holy meant. To them, Sabrina was just another adult. She found herself playing pitchball and other games with the children, partly for companionship, partly to avoid conversations with believers that always strayed into topics she cared not to discuss. At least with Sprocket she could discuss the mechanics of the weaponry, a welcome change to the best posture for prayer or the right words to use when asking the master to heal a bunion or gout. But her conversation with Sprocket died if they strayed to anything else. In the end, Sabrina feared she was still the same person, the same child she had always been, standing on the edge of the playground, alone. Lindsey had changed that before. Sometimes she changed it now, when she was around. But as they entered the caves, Lindsey did not emerge from the throngs to greet her. She was likely busy teaching first aid, leading a reading circle, or learning one of the forbidden languages from Grange. The main hall was crowded, which Sabrina hated. She preferred eating later or sooner than everyone else. No matter what time she came, though she never asked, the women always wanted to serve her extra helpings. She shared her extra portions with the skinniest children, many of whom she was certain had intestines full of worms. Is freedom worth that? The air was pungent with smoke from the cooking fires, and her eyes and throat burned. Sprocket cursed as he noticed one of the ventilation fans had broken again. It would fall to him to repair it. The air seemed to make no difference to the rebels. They were gathered in tight knots on carpets, scattered haphazardly over the cave floor. Children romped on the stage, kicking a ball made of rubbish and twine, their footsteps sounding like the beats of a bass drum on the boards. Denalice was on cooking duty tonight, looking out of place among all the smaller women doling out food. Sabrina could not help smiling at his apron and how he had been forced to wear a wrap over his hair. A thick-set man with a forked beard, one of the soldiers, found Denalice's appearance amusing as well and made a crude joke at his expense. "Keep moving, Jarrus," Denalice said. "Cooking and killing people. Just be glad I'm doing the former tonight and not the latter." The men behind Jarrus laughed, diffusing some of the tension among the women in the serving line. But Sabrina felt on edge, the back of her neck tingling. Something in the way the men spoke and laughed, the heavy smell of sweat and boiling masculinity, made her wary. With her bowl of food, she passed through a group of soldiers on her way to find a rug to settle on, wearing the mask of imperviousness she had learned to use in the station. When Grange entered the far side of the hall, she felt some level of relief. She found Lindsey at the center of a full carpet, 24 people gathered in a circle around her. The afternoon's reading session had gone over into dinner time. Sabrina knew there was little hope in visiting Lindsey over this meal, but she settled for listening to the conversation. A woman was asking something about understanding the master and his intentions. She wanted reasons for unexplainable things, such as her child dying. Sabrina thought a little more soap and hand-washing could have saved a number of children. Lindsey provided the best answer she could. "We can't understand his or her mind any more than an ant could understand all the things Sprocket knows in order to fix a fan, a turbine, or a communicator." Sprocket, who had placed himself at the edge of the circle, smiled at Lindsey. "Theopin says we can be free of suffering in the next life," a man said. "That I don't know," Lindsey replied. "Grange says we will only be frustrated if we try to find freedom from suffering. Instead, we should think in terms of freedom through suffering. Suffering is inevitable, but we can offer it as a prayer." "But a prayer for what?" the woman asked again. "If I am but an ant to the master, what do my prayers for an end to our oppression matter to him? If he is so great, does he even notice my voice?" Lindsey shook her head, her eyes filled with sympathy that seemed to draw the woman and all those around her closer. "I don't know. Sometimes I do wonder if he can hear us. He is the creator of the cosmos. It's not like you can invite him to dinner." The crowd chuckled, and Lindsey smiled with them. "What I like to believe is that our whole life is a prayer, our actions making up the words, and the words sentences, and the sentences a story. And in the end, our life is like that. It's the story that is the sum of all our actions, and it's by this story that he knows us in our entirety." The circle was quiet. Even Sprocket was nodding his head thoughtfully. Sabrina scraped a hardened piece of sauce with her spoon that had not been thoroughly scrubbed away since the bowl was last used. She scanned the room for Grange. She was tired of the conversation. Something about Lindsey's answers was making her angry, though she was not sure why. The believers would sit for hours arguing different points of view presented to them by Grange or Theopin, but Sabrina did not always see the distinction, when all of it seemed like make-believe to her. Shouts and the sound of scuffling disrupted the discussion. 2 figures tumbled out of the cluster of soldiers seated on the floor a few carpets away, and quickly fell to the floor, grappling. Sabrina dropped her bowl and ran between groups of startled onlookers. Her gait was unsteady, her right leg still sore. She had to struggle against the tide of people fleeing the mayhem and a stationary wall of soldiers who had gathered to witness it. Grange broke through the wall of onlookers moments before she did, and threw himself between the 2 men, unfazed by the stray punches that glanced off his shoulders and face. "Enough!" he cried. "Are you all animals? Is this what we risked our lives for? To escape only to kill each other? If the master is with me," one of the men from the fight said, his broken teeth rolling across his swollen lips. His opponent, Jarrus, with the forked beard who had insulted Denalis earlier, mocked him, pounding his chest as if to insist the master was with him. "Don't speak to me about what he wills," Grange said, his face turning red under his silver beard, the veins in his temple growing thick. "If another man challenges his fellow brother, he will spend a month in the cages." The soldiers grumbled but dispersed, a few staying behind to help the man who had lost his teeth. Grange was already halfway to the exit before Sabrina picked him out of the crowd again. She raced to catch up, her sore leg protesting the exertion. She called his name just as a shard of pain twisted in her thigh. If he heard, he did not stop. She finally caught him in the corridor when he stepped aside to let a woman carrying a mat of blood grass pass. "Grange, what did he mean, if the master is with me?" He spun around, his nostrils wide with controlled breath. "What do you think he meant?" He turned back and continued down the hall. Sabrina grimaced, the pain increasing in her thigh. "Grange, wait!" He stopped, eyes blazing. "That is the 5th fight I've had to break up this week.
You may not have meant to, but you've induced a whole new belief. If I can do it, then the Master must be with me. You've exonerated perpetrators and incriminated the victims at once. You have to know I never meant for that to happen. What choice did they give me?"
He sighed, placed his hands over his face as if in an attempt to wipe the anger away. When he removed them, he looked tired, the skin sagging beneath his eyes. He reached out to touch Sabrina's shoulder.
"I know. I'm sorry. It is not right for me to raise my voice at you. It is just that we are on the edge of a knife. Our people are so poised to go in one direction or the other, one of violence or one of peace.
Grange, even you carry a weapon. Even you have spoken of the need to resist and fight back."
"I know, but as I translate more, as I uncover more, I wonder if that is what our Master truly intends. And yet—"
He paused, his eyes searching the corridor around him for anyone listening.
"And yet Theopin seems eager to use this new belief to have us march on the cities. If we can do it, then the Master must be behind us. It is not without precedent in the text we've translated. An attack is coming? I don't know. I don't wish it. It would be ruinous for so many. If I believe in an alternative, if I represent an alternative, I fear I would be forced to take a side, to lay down my weapons. How much believability will my faith have if I don't?"
It was a question for Sabrina. She had no answer. She shook her head, her lips moving but no words emerging. Grange rubbed his temples with his palms and began to walk away.
"I don't like being forced to do anything."
Sabrina followed Lindsey to the sanctuary at night. It was late. The buzzing of cicadas and crickets had given way to the melancholy cries of owls. No moon had entered the sky, but the stars were bright, so bright that Sabrina could make out Lindsey's shape against them, as well as the contours of the hillside and the skeletal shapes of the thorn trees. As they walked, Sabrina watched the sky warily, ready to spring to cover at the slightest hint of an Elved. But their luck held, and they reached the cave, the scent of beeswax and epoxy welcome. Strangely, the sanctuary had become one of Sabrina's favorite places, where the air was not thick with overcrowding, and she had Lindsey to herself. Lindsey greeted the guard and the two old men who were just leaving, their heads bowed and covered. Even in the darkness, their smiles shone when they passed Lindsey. Sabrina took up her customary place on the edge of the carpets, settling herself against the cool stone while Lindsey continued inside, her shadows mingling with those on the wall, so that multiples of her danced alongside the dark shapes of suns, swords, and moons. It was all a messy illusion to Sabrina, and yet she knew if this sanctuary were to disappear, she would mourn the loss. This confused her, since previously the place had aroused only disgust within her. But she could not deny the candlelight was soothing, its color as appealing as the colors in one of Lindsey's murals. She closed her eyes. There was so much she wanted to speak to Lindsey about when her friend finished praying. So much of the day played out before her mind's eye. Theopin's speech, her discomfort about helping Sprocket with weapons, the fight, Grange, broken teeth, split knuckles. It was all a story that seemed to be repeating itself, from a playground in Fortinbras to a desert refuge. When she opened her eyes, Theopin was there. He wore a wan smile. Soft light and indistinct shadows flickered back and forth across his face, the shading accentuating his high cheekbones and his well-set jaw. He did not blink. He had come too close without her knowing.
"Thieves and murderers creep up on people," she said. "And the penitent come to holy places with their voices stilled, to better hear the voice of the Master." She said nothing. He seemed comfortable with the silence. Perhaps he was listening to that voice of the Master. He remained in place, his hands clasped neatly, his chin raised as if he were perched on a promontory, gazing out into a great expanse of desert, and not into the darkness of Weeping Stone. "I feel that you, Sabrina, will never believe like we do," he said after a long intake of breath. He bent down next to her, his body folding gracefully. "Will you?" "What do you want?" "I want you to see Cadet Sabrina. I am fine seeing what I can see, says the infant who can only see the ceiling above her crib. But someday the child must grow, leave the nursery, and engage with the world.
His hands moved beneath his robes, and a blaster, her blaster, emerged. Her pulse quickened. Immediately she was calibrating options. With her left foot she could kick the blaster. With her right hand she could blind him with the dirt she was now slowly curling into her fist. But the blaster remained stationary, the handle facing her.
Take it, Theopin said. It is rightfully yours. I don't even know how to use one.
Sabrina took it, glancing at Lindsey, who was still deep in prayer. Sabrina flicked it on. The hum of the power cell, the weight, the molded handle in her palm were familiar and reassuring. Theopin continued to watch her, his face unreadable.
If you are willing to come with me, your suit is outside.
He got up to leave. Sabrina followed him around the corner a few steps, then stopped.
Why are you doing this? Because you are blind, Sabrina. And I know you want the truth. You never would have come to the center of the desert if you did not want the truth. I was helping my friend. Why did you help her in the first place? What had you learned to make you break your oaths?
He let the question hang in the air for a moment before resuming his exit.
Is that what you are seeking, Theopin? The truth?
She asked as she followed him to the cave mouth.
It is,
he said, turning so she could see him smile.
But we are all on our own journeys. Yours goes south. A day's walk from here is the wall. Follow the wadi out of the valley, then the Red Mountain Ridge. It will provide you cover. It is not safe. It is very dangerous. The wall is patrolled by soldiers in suits like your own, and Elveds. It is where the Elveds live, you see. A few buzz around the city cores, but they are truly demons of the desert. Their mission is not to keep the peace, but rather to keep us trapped inside here, away from the truth. Go stand on the wall and look to the other side, Cadet. You will see.
See what?
See what you are seeing.
He repeated her words back to her.
Is it desolation on the other side? Is it? Maybe you should look for yourself. I don't think you will believe me. Come.
Outside the cave mouth, he turned back up the hill and gestured to a thorn tree. From its pain-ridden branches, her suit hung like a soul.
Clean, oiled, and charged. A bag of provisions sits on that rock there.
Sabrina stepped close to examine the suit, inhaling the smell of mesh and the fresh oil on its joints. The bag next to it was full of water bottles, sealed packs of biscuits, and even a thermal blanket. When she turned to Theopin, he was already descending the hillside. Sabrina let out an awkward, "Thank you."
I will let Lindsey know where you have gone. Go with grace, sister, but go with haste. Cover what ground you can at night. Rest during the heat of the day. Be sure to come back safe.
Theopin's form receded into darkness.
So you can share your revelations.